You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. By going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com, you can make this possible. All right, folks, allow me to deconstruct what Biden's problem is, okay? You heard him speak at the debate. He tried to push back against Senator Kamala Harris. Then he goes before Rainbow Push, and what he says is he supported voluntary busing, but he opposed the Department of Education mandating busing. Now, busing. Let me take y'all back to the 60s. You look at the Black Freedom Movement starting August 28th, really August 28th, 1955, with the lynching of Emmett Till. The Montgomery bus boycott starts December 1st, 1955, okay, in Montgomery, Alabama. Then all of a sudden you go through the end of the 50s and now you go into the 60s. That was first of all, that was the 57 Civil Rights Act, which was the first Civil Rights Act in America since Reconstruction, since 1875, okay? So all of a sudden you then go through 1960, and then you get to 64, a 64 Civil Rights Act, a 65 Voting Rights Act, and a 68 Fair Housing Act. Now, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., NAACP, Urban League, and all those civil rights organizations, they actually wanted a massive civil rights bill when Kennedy became president. They then said, Kennedy was like, no, can't do it. He gets assassinated November 22nd, 1963. LBJ then says, I cannot pass all of that at one time. So he essentially broke up the massive civil rights bill into three distinct bills. The first one was in 64, which dealt with public accommodations. 65 dealt with voting. Then you get the Fair Housing Act. Now here's the point that you have to understand how busing is tied to it. White Northerners, okay, had no issue with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, okay? Because what you were dealing with here is Southern Dixiecrats, racists in the South, and conservative Republicans who did not want to support civil rights. You did have Democrats and Republicans who voted for all of these bills. So after 65, what was the problem with housing? Now, y'all did hear me say that the Civil Rights Act was in 64. The Voting Rights Act was in 65. The Fair Housing Act didn't come for another 3 years. Why did it take 3 years? Because here's why. Because Northern Democrats and Northern Republicans, their constituents didn't want black folks living next to them. They opposed those measures. In fact, you had Senator Edward Brooke, the first African-American elected to the United States Senate since Reconstruction from Massachusetts, a Republican, who was fighting the filibuster and the blockade in the United States Senate of a fair housing bill. What happened? In early 1968, they were able to finally break the logjam, and the Senate passed the Fair Housing Act. What then happened? The House said, not doing a damn thing. Not going to do it. We don't care. King gets assassinated on April 4th, 1968. On April 5th, 1968, LBJ sends a letter to Congress saying to the House, we should pass this law. Dr. King gave his life for this law, and this is how we should honor his life. 9 days later, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was passed and signed into law. Now, why does all of this matter dealing with Joe Biden? Because busing was the next wave in the early 70s. Those same white people in the North who did not want black folks living next to them, they also didn't want their kids going to integrated schools. Now, let me use conservative Ben Shapiro to further highlight what I'm talking about. He released a video trying to explain this whole deal, and he completely missed the racist whites and what their view was in the early 70s. Press play.
There's a big difference between forced busing and desegregation. Okay, the forcible integration and desegregation are not the same thing. Forced busing was a government-sponsored policy in non-Jim Crow states, by the way, in Boston, right, in Los Angeles, in which the government was forcing children, 12-year-olds, to get on buses and go to schools at places they didn't know, far from their homes, both black kids and white kids, in an attempt to establish some sort of statistical racial integration. It led...
Now, why does it matter what he's saying? He's saying the government did forced busing. Folks, you do know the government did the exact same thing with public accommodations. It was use of force by the government when Eisenhower sent National Guards to protect the Little Rock Nine to escort them into school. The government used the full force of the federal government to ensure that black kids could walk into a school. The exact same thing happened in Alabama, where Governor George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door, would not let 2 black students at the University of Alabama attend classes. The exact same thing. The difference here is that what Ben does not want to admit is that forced busing was the next wave. Why? Because you had white folks who said, we're going to flee these places, go out to these suburban areas, open our own build our own communities, open our own schools to get away from all them black people as a result of Brown versus Board of Education and Brown 2. Play the rest of what Shapiro had to say.
The very predictable consequence of parents pulling their kids out of those schools in general, moving them to private schools or charter schools, devastating tax bases in precisely the cities that needed the tax base to stay the most. It led people to...
Okay, what Ben is saying is white folks did not want their kids going to school with black students. Now, he said, oh my God, they left, enrolled them in private school. We call that white flight. So they didn't say, well, no, we can't have that. Why did they enroll them in private schools? Private schools were not governed by the government. Public schools were. What does this have? Okay, you know what? Press play and I'll fully explain how Joe Biden is mixing all of this.
To move from those areas further and further into suburbia, leading to even more de facto, not de jure means by law, de facto segregation. Forced busing was an enormous policy failure. It was started with the best of intentions. The government didn't have that authority, and not only didn't the government have that authority, the government was reaching into the private lives of its citizens and forcing them to do something. And this is a big problem. Forced busing was bad policy, and opposing forced busing did not make you a racist. In many cases, opposing forced busing was about ensuring that people continued to live together in the same community and that schools were organized by community, as opposed to forcing people to get up in the morning, take a 45-minute drive via bus to some other school they didn't know in a community they didn't know. As I say, black schools, many of them were forcibly shut down by the state because they had to redistribute the black students in such a way as to meet the legal requirements set by the Supreme Court in Milliken, as a case from the 1980s. All of this was bad policy.
Okay, first of all, how could busing be based upon a Supreme Court decision in the 80s when we're discussing busing that took place in the 70s? Might want to get your decades straight, Ben. See, y'all, here's what Ben does not want to tell you. White folks did not want black people going to their schools. He also talked about these things were happening in non-Jim Crow states. You know what that means? Because white people in the North, they said, oh, that segregation thing, that's a Southern thing. We're great white people. But they were in denial. Why do you think the white folks in Boston so fiercely opposed busing? They despised Senator Ted Kennedy. First of all, why was there even a need for busing? Do you know why? Because Brown versus Board of Education took place in 1954. They said all deliberate speed, and here we were some 16, 17 years later, and we still had inequities. Why? He said, well, folks wanted to go into the areas where they grew up and where the communities are. People look like them. Do you know what that meant? White people with means said, we're going to hold our resources, build our schools, the hell with y'all. The government said, oh, no, white folks. Y'all ain't getting off that easy. We're going to bus black kids to the better schools that y'all set up to give them access to those schools. Ben is saying that's a horrible idea because they didn't want us in their schools. Y'all, now let me also help you out so you can understand what the school system in America is set up based upon what? Communities. White people had means. So they said, you know what? The way we can keep black people out, is hell. We're just going to move further out, build communities with more expensive homes. They can't afford to live here. That system is still set up today because they ran away from black people. They never wanted their kids to go to school with us. And when they fled, the government said, no, we're going to send the black kids not to achieve some kind of stat, but for the black kids to have access to the high-quality education that white kids were getting. Senator Joe Biden was a young United States senator from Delaware, and his white constituents wanted him to say, they can't tell us what to do. Now, I'm about to go to Reverend Jesse Jackson in just 1 second. Why is all this important? Because the argument that Joe Biden is making is that I was cool with voluntary busing and not forced busing is the same thing that segregationists said, we don't want the federal government telling us what to do. It's the exact same argument. So Biden is saying, I was cool with voluntary busing. Oh, no. I thought this and this and this, but not this. Because northern whites did not see themselves as racist. They thought Bull Connor was a racist. They thought the folks in Albany, Georgia were racist, and all across the South. And they said, but no, we just want our schools together. That's why he's wrong. All Joe Biden had to say was 3 words. I was wrong. I should not have taken the position. That would have eliminated all this, but for some reason he can't do it. Because what he doesn't want to accept is the reality that he was defending white folks not wanting black kids in their schools. Schools are about resources. Resources in America are determined by neighborhoods and communities. Neighborhoods and communities are determined by the value of homes. The value of homes in America are determined by the wages and the salaries of the very folks buying those homes. The reason you have segregated schools in America today is not because of charter schools. It's not because of magnet schools. It's because neighborhoods are based upon people. And if white folks in America have more money, you're going to see largely white neighborhoods. And black folks do not have as much money. You will see, guess what? Largely black neighborhoods, largely Hispanic neighborhoods. This all boils down to money. And Joe Biden, all he had to say was, I was wrong. It was simple as that. I was wrong then. He could shut all of this down, but he doesn't want to use those 3 words because it still holds, and that's the problem. She was right, Vice President Biden. You're not a racist. But the reality is you were defending what is so deep down inside of white America, and that's why they oppose busing. Busing has a direct link to Brown versus Board of Education. And that's why this thing is still so prevalent. And that's why he aligned with the segregationists in the South to get to be against busing, because they both believe the same thing. And that is, we don't want the federal government telling us what to do. And black America, the only way we have been able to get rights in this country is by the federal government telling folks what to do, which is why yesterday's Supreme Court decision on dealing with gerrymandering is so important, because it is not political gerrymandering. It is race-based gerrymandering that impacts political. Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., I know you were on the phone. Let me go to you right now. Reverend Jackson, are you there?
How are you doing today, my brother?
Reverend, I was just laying out.
Hello?
Yes, Reverend, you there? You got me? Reverend,
I am here.
Reverend, I was just laying out. All Joe Biden had to say was, I was wrong. His position on busing was really defending those white folks in the North who did not want black kids going to their high-quality schools. That is the real issue here, and he just won't do it.
Can I bring it another way?
Go ahead.
He chose states' rights over federal intervention, and tried to justify he didn't mind voluntary busing, but court order was inappropriate. The fact of the matter is, states' rights, we had to intervene. The 54 decision was an intervention against states' rights. The Montgomery bus stop was an intervention against states' rights. The right to vote was that. And so he was on the wrong side of history. So just as he made an adjustment on the Hyde Amendment, he made on his supremacist views, the states' rights views, on other dimensions as well.
And Reverend, I just don't understand. And again, let's just understand the moment. He was a young United States senator who ran against a guy who was espousing racist views. He beats him. The reality is he was representing his white constituents in Delaware with the position that he took. And they saw this whole segregation thing as, oh, that's a Southern thing. But when the federal government said, hold up, North, y'all got some racism too, the white folks said, oh, hell no, what are y'all doing? That's Alabama, Mississippi. This not us. And they said, yes, Brown versus Board of Education impacts y'all too.
Well, Roland, let me put it this way. You know, after 246 years in slavery, the Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis represented slavery, secession, segregation, and sedition. And Lincoln made the decision, a very practical decision, to free us, and we saved him. And 200,000 joined the Union Army, and we broke the backbone of the South trying to break away and form another country. Federal intervention was an anathema to slavery. So it was an anathema to Jim Crow. But for too long, the federal government itself tolerated Jim Crow. 5,000 blacks were lynched between 1880 and 1940. The federal government virtually did nothing. But 54 decision, the Supreme Court intervention against Jim Crow laws. Now the King and Rosa Parks in 55. They won the court suit in 56 for an intervention. Busing was a means. It's interesting about busing. It wasn't the bus, it was us. Not the bus, it's us. Most American children bus every day now.
Yep.
All rural kids are bus every day now. Most suburban school kids are bus now, and most urban school kids are bus now. Now the shift from race-based to tax-based, we're preparing now a lawsuit because the race gap in a technical sense closed. The resource gap is a gap now.
Right.
And it's based upon tax-based funding of public education. So I think you've educated the nation very well today. I thank you.
Reverend Jackson, always a pleasure. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, sir. All right, folks, I want to bring in my panel right now because, again, and I'm walking you through this here because it's critically important. Erica Savage, host, Savage Politics. Mustafa Santiago Ali, former senior advisor for the EPA, and Eugene Craig, CEO of the Eugene Craig Organization. Erica, I'll start with you. Erica, the reason we have to walk through this history is because so many people don't understand the nuance. And when Senator Harris turns to Vice President Biden and she makes the comment, you're not a racist. Here's, I think, the problem that people have. The problem I think we have in this country is that when we have these conversations about race, this is a discussion. You're racist. I'm not a racist. That's it. We don't deal with all the stuff that's in between. We don't deal with those who believe in racial inferiority. We don't deal with the perception. We don't deal with all of those different things. What we had here, and again, to me, this is one of those things where, dude, if you've evolved on gay marriage, being a hardcore Catholic, you have to be, and this is where white folks have to own up to their shit. There were views and perspectives in our communities, and you know what? There were people who did not think themselves were racist. But the reality is they did not want their children being bused somewhere else or black kids being bused to their schools because it came down to resources and opportunity.
Right, absolutely. And I'm glad that you laid the foundation, Roland, which is so important because as we enter into a general election cycle in 2020, voters are going to have to know more than a 2019 person. They're going to have to review and research. And Joe Biden has a 40-year record. It's not enough that he served as the vice president of the first African-American president in history. It's really about what this presidency is going to mean for black folk, particularly since black women voters are the key, are the ticket to who's going to be elected as the Democratic nominee. And when you talked about states, right, and you invoked Albany, Georgia. So if you don't know, I am from Albany, Georgia. I'm a proud person who is from Albany, Georgia. And I'm so glad that you brought that up because, as you said, it is folks who live in the North, and I've had this conversation with many of my friends who are from the North who always like to invoke and espouse, and we see that with the revolution of Twitter and all these other social media platforms to kind of shout down at, well, as you said, I'm not a racist, you know, that person is a racist, and then the conversation ends there. Secondly, you're talking about the whole busing piece. We go back to where, you know, everybody's being bused to, that is the schoolhouse. And so in those traditional settings, this type of information is not brought forth, which is why it is incumbent and it is so important for people to really review, look back, find out how all these things connect so that that person becomes a more informed voter and then has a better understanding why they're seeing gentrification happening on steroids, right, who opportunity zones are for. Those things are very important as voters head to the ballot.
I want y'all to re-rack Biden speaking into the rainbow push. I want y'all to let me know when that is ready. And so play it. I'm going to go to Mustafa. But I need y'all to listen to what he says. I need y'all to understand, listen to what he says, and I'm going to connect this thing to 2019. Press play.
Well, look, before I start, I'd like to say something about the debate we had last night. And I heard and I listened to and I respect Senator Harris. But, you know, we all know that 30 seconds to 60 seconds on a campaign debate exchange can't do justice to a lifetime committed to civil rights. I want to be absolutely clear about my record and position on racial justice, including busing. I never, ever opposed voluntary busing. And as a program that Senator Harris participated in, and it made a difference in her life. I did support federal action to address root causes of segregation in our schools and our communities, including taking on the banks and redlining and trying to change the way in which neighborhoods were segregated. I've always been...
Stop. Mustafa, this is why is that important? Because you can't say I took on the root cause of these problems, yet I fought a solution to the problem. That's what and that's the piece I think, and connected to today, if you become president, you're going to have to deal with the outgrowth of the root cause and still got to figure out how do we fix the problem.
Yeah. And it speaks to, have you truly evolved or not? You know, he unfortunately continues to be anchored to the past and some of the decisions that he made incorrectly. And as he said, it was interesting when he said, you know, you can't take 30 or 60 seconds. And as you said earlier, it took 3 seconds to just say, I was wrong. And he still has difficulty in being able to do that. And he just, for whatever reason, and you know, I bumped into him when we were down, when I was down in Miami, and I was hoping that he would be able to better articulate his growth when the cameras weren't around. You know, sometimes people will actually be more honest about what's going on. And it just, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to get it. And unfortunately, I don't know if a lot of people are going to allow him. Never mind. It's not even a matter of allowing him. He has to make a decision if he is going to support formally racist sort of positioning, if he is going to continue to not take responsibility for some of his actions and the disinvestment that were happening inside of communities that was a driver.
Eugene, the thing that again, this is where I think Biden loses it. I think for, again, a lot of white folks who were in the North, they saw dogs, batons, black folks being beaten, black folks being killed, black folks being lynched. They're like, oh my God, no. But what they didn't say is, wait a minute. What's the level of racism that exists in our communities when we have slums that we're not repairing, yet we're charging black people 4 and 5 times the rent? If anybody goes back, and see, and this is the thing that, again, for people who have never actually studied Malcolm X and studied Dr. King, when Dr. King went to Los Angeles after the Watts riot, people understand, although Dr. King traveled around the country, Dr. King was a man of the South. That's what he knew. He knew it. He understood it. It wasn't until King went to Chicago, and it wasn't until he went to L.A. with the Watts riots that he then began to understand Northern racism. Black Southerners saw the North as freedom land. He goes to L.A. and says, my God, in fact, King and LBJ, if you read Nick Cott's book, Judgment Days, both of them fell into this massive depression after the Watts riot because they had just passed a major civil rights bill, and Watts happened right after that. And so whites in the North had this whole other view. That's not us. We're totally different. But they didn't want to address it. Malcolm X was speaking to the racism in the North that blacks were feeling in New York City, in Newark, in Philadelphia, which was totally different than what was being felt in the South. They could vote in the North. They couldn't vote in the South, but the racism was just as visceral in the North. It just didn't look like it because it didn't have the police dogs and the water cannons in public.
You're 100% correct. Even if you look at a lot of our major cities and population centers today, here in Baltimore, is the vestiges of the policies of the 60s and 70s of racial economics. You can see it in Baltimore. You can see it in Philadelphia. You can see it in Boston. Was home of our American Revolution. You can still see it in today. It's something that is not just a thing of the past. Something that is very well alive in the present. It's one of the drivers of the whole of the gentrification fight, where now white folk are trying to move back to these urban population centers and driving up the cost of things. But to address Joe Biden. I think it's actually very sad that he just can't admit fault and move forward from it. From a political standpoint, what's going on with him is what goes on with a lot of presidential campaigns and a lot of high-level campaigns where they'll black staff but not listen to the black staff and go wherever their white advisor tells them to do. So I can't get that he had some Keisha Lance or Cedric Rick or Simone Sanders in his ear and still continuing going out and letting this issue thrive faster, even up to the point.
And again, I need folks to understand. I know exactly what Senator Kamala Harris was saying when she made her point. First of all, guys, let me know if Elie Mystal, executive editor of Above the Law and contributor to The Nation, if we have pulled him up, please. I'm going to pull him into this. So I'm going to pull him in this conversation and tie me into something that he wrote. Elie, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So you wrote a piece dealing with the Supreme Court ruling, dealing with political gerrymandering and the impact on race. And the reality is this here. And folks, and for all y'all who are watching and listening, I'm purposely tying all this stuff together because it is all knitted together just in different ways. In North Carolina, they initially fought the gerrymandering utilizing race. Reverend William Barber and the NAACP, they focused on race. Common Cause said, no, we're going to focus on political gerrymandering. Folks, they won by focusing on racial gerrymandering. the liberal white folks decided, well, no, let's go for political. So what now happens? The political case goes to the Supreme Court, gets kicked back 5-4 because they didn't listen to black people. What you're dealing with this gerrymandering case, Ellie, is also tied to this whole Biden thing in the past with busing, because what you have is you have folks who want to talk about America in the abstract. So when Biden says, I was focusing on things that were the root cause, what that really means, if I could somehow redefine what he said, is I'm focusing on that other stuff. But when it came into his backyard, when it came into his constituents' backyard, they said, hey, y'all go deal with that other stuff, not what's happening in my backyard. And that's really what Biden was dealing with when he opposed busing. And white America, Ellie, just can't get past this notion that if they didn't have a Klan robe, or they were not sicking dogs on people, that somehow I had no racial feeling whatsoever. That's really what's at play here.
What I feel, when you want to talk about root causes, I always think that the Supreme Court is one of the key root causes, right?
Yes.
What white people, I think, not all white people, obviously, what some white people really fear is that sharing of power, right? And that's how you get into school segregation. That's also how you get into busing, and that's certainly how you get into gerrymandering. What gerrymandering is trying to do when white people do it is to keep from having to share power with the minorities in their community, right? Like if you have a district with equal representation, Democrats and Republicans split into 4 districts, there are lots of ways that you can do that. You can make 4 districts that are 50-50 Democrat-Republican. You could make 2 districts that are Republican and 2 districts that are Democrats. Or you could make 3 districts that are Republican and 1 super district that's Democrat, and that's what the gerrymanderers, that's what the Republicans want to do. That is essentially what they did in North Carolina. So now there are 2 different ways, and you brought this up, and it's a really important point. There are 2 different ways to kind of constitutionally think about that issue, right? On the one hand, you can think about it as a political gerrymander, the way that I just split it up, Democrats, Republicans. The other way you can do it is that you can think about it as a racial gerrymander. You want to put all the white people in the 3 districts and all the black people in the 1 district, right? What Roberts did yesterday, in honestly one of the worst decisions that I have read, is that he parsed the difference between political gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, trying to say that he was trying to help black people, by the way. We'll get to that. But he parsed the difference between political gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering and said that when it's political, when the Republicans are just doing it to beat the crap out of the Democrats, that's not just constitutionally fine. That means that is so constitutional that the courts cannot even review it. The only way in that situation that you can get redress for having your vote essentially gerrymandered out of existence is to win an election, which is a completely Kafkaesque circular argument that Roberts laid down. But when it comes to the racial gerrymander, no. Then the courts can allegedly still strike down a gerrymander that's just about race, because that would violate equal protection. And that seems like a victory for black people, but it ain't. Because what Roberts wants to do with that, and what especially your boy Clarence Thomas wants to do with that, is that he wants to say that gerrymanders that have been done so that black people can have pick their own representative, right? So that Harlem can have a representative for Harlem and not a representative for the Upper West Side of New York, which might not turn out to be a person of color. So they want to, Clarence Thomas and John Roberts want to be able to strike down that gerrymander and say that you can't break up your districts so that you can make sure that you have a black representative, a Latino representative, and a Jewish representative, and a LGBT representative. No. That's unconstitutional. But if you just want to do it so that Republicans beat the crap out of Democrats every day, that's fine. That was the decision.
And what you're dealing with, Erica, and again, we're knitting all this together, folks, because you need to understand the commentary I did yesterday about how all of these things are interrelated, the political, the local, the state, the national, and the courts. If you go back to, I believe it was 1883, when the Supreme Court invalidated the 1875 Civil Rights Act, and they literally wrote, the Supreme Court, to Ellie's point about how they really, really made a determination in America whether we were going to have true segregation or we're going to have freedom, depending upon the time period you're living in. That Supreme Court literally said Congress could not outlaw segregation because of states' rights. And so when Biden is saying, I was for voluntary, not forced, what he's saying is, I didn't want the federal government telling a local city council or a local city school district or a local county government or what to do. Well, that is exactly why the federal government had to intervene, because, as Ellie just laid out, when white folks are in control of the levers of power, they are going to use it to their benefit.
Absolutely, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell keeps continuing to prove that over and over again. And you brought up Tom Cotton earlier in that tweet that he sent out, which is juxtaposes Ronald Reagan when he ran, goes down to Mississippi, and he's winking and nodding and telling them, listen, I'm not going to take away your state's right. I will be the president of the United States, but I'm your president as well. So it doesn't just cross, it's not just concentrated in one party. It goes to one dominant racist own interest. And so that, again, is also why it's important to be a student of history and also to pay attention to global history, what we saw happen in South Africa, where you do have a majority of people that are locked out of power because the minority, you see, the minority folks are locked out of power because the majority saw the wave coming, and they solidify a concentration where it doesn't matter if it's 80% of you all. We will still retain political power.
Eugene, I'm going to go to you right down there, Mustafa. Pull up the tweet of Tom Cotton. I'm about to link that to this, folks. This is what Tom Cotton, of course, Republican from Arkansas, this is what he had the audacity, the unmitigated gall to tweet last night after the Democratic debate. Pull the tweet up, folks. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are helpfully reminding Americans that the Democrats were the party of slavery, secession, and segregation. By contrast, the Republican Party was founded on and has always stood for the natural equality of all men and women. Eugene, I tweeted him last night, and I said, really? Well, why won't you speak to why you said, when they were talking about the crime bill, that more Americans should be put in prison, Senator Cotton? I then said, Senator Cotton, please speak to the issue of voter suppression and the targeting of black voters, and Republican Party going along with that. And I went down the line. So here you again have a white Republican and Tom Cotton representing lots of black folks in Arkansas who supports policies that are race-based, but he wants to say, oh, it's those Democrats in their past, as if the Republican Party doesn't have its own past, because it too benefited from white supremacy and benefited from Jim Crow, and yes, benefited from slavery.
Forget the past, we're already in the current future and present. It's been a downward spiral since the chairmanship of Chairman Priebus. The thing is this: Tom Cotton's in no position to speak on these things. Most GOP senators and members of the House aren't in position to speak on these things because they are in lockstep with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who we know to be an unabashed racist, both in policy and in deed. And so, the thing is this, the Dixiecrats, are your current day Republicans in many places. Your Democrats are, still, some of them are still hold racist views as well. There's racism in both parties. But Tom Cotton is in absolutely no position to speak on this, especially some of the votes that he's taken, some of the policies that he's opposed, and some of the narratives that he's pushed as a U.S. Senator.
Mustafa, the mistake I think the people are making, they're saying, oh, that's right, see, that's it. I ain't voting for Biden. You know what? I'm not going to vote for Harris because, you know, she was Attorney General, and this is what she did when she's Attorney General. And then they say, oh, I'm not going to vote for Castro, and then I need to see this, I need to see that. But what these folks need to understand is they had better open their damn eyes to the much broader picture. There is a very clear and concise plan of action by today's Republican Party, knowing full well that America is about to become a majority minority nation. The Republican Party today, and I have no problem saying it, wants this nation to, in many ways, to be like South Africa. Mm-hmm. How can we lock in power using the courts, mm-hmm. which is now reinforced political gerrymandering, which now means the control of the state legislatures and the gubernatorial mansions in these largely southern states, throwing in these western states, throwing in these midwestern states for the next 50 years. Yep. That is what is at play. And anybody out there who is saying, I'm not going to vote, you're a dumbass if you don't understand that they want to control America for your children, not just you.
Yeah, and your children's children. It's the strategy that's in place to make sure that you hold on to power. And, you know, we talk about how important the courts are, because the courts are going to make some decisions that are actually going to guide what the states are doing, going to guide how policy is being interpreted and moving forward along with the laws. And I hope folks will finally wake up and get this. So, you know, when we're going to having this conversation about gerrymandering, it's so much larger because this is going to be determining who has the power of their vote. This is also going to determine who is going to get the resources to be able to deal with housing, who's going to be able to deal with the resources that are necessary to make sure transportation routes are not extracting wealth from your community and bringing wealth back into your community. Who is going to have the power to determine, what's going on with the environmental issues and jobs and so forth and so on. All of it ties back into your vote, and the vote is controlled by the way the gerrymandering places certain power into certain people's hands.
And Ellie, we saw what happened in Florida, where the people went to the polls, passed Amendment 4 to restore the voting rights of the formerly incarcerated, and it was a Republican Party in Florida that got there because of, I will say, racial/political gerrymandering. A supermajority completely overruled the voters, put in this poll tax, and now what people thought was going to be upwards of 1.4 million people getting the right to vote, they're like, nope, we're going to lock this in, because they knew exactly what that meant. Which means that if you're sitting your ass watching right now and saying, I'm not going to vote because I'm not hearing the perfect candidate, you had better understand that you not voting, you literally are doing exactly what they want to do. And let's not forget when Donald Trump said the African Americans were great, they didn't vote in 2016.
I agree with everything that's been said. You can't let your vote be colonized by the Republican Party, because that's what they're trying to do to it. As other of your guests have said, I think it was Erica who just said it, the Republican Party plan is exactly like the white South African plan. Like that's not hyperbole. They understand that they're about to be a minority, that we're about to be a majority minority nation. They understand that they cannot win either statewide or national elections if everybody votes, and they certainly understand that they cannot win if all people of color vote. So their attack is to both directly suppress the vote. I mean, just straight up like lose ballots and change polling time, like just straight up directly suppress the vote. Their plan is also to demotivate the vote impartially by, oh, this candidate has this problem, this candidate has that problem, maybe you should just stay at home, maybe you should just vote third party, like that's also part of their plan. And if all else fails, that's when they kick it up to the courts, who will, as you said, what's happening in Florida is a poll tax. We have an amendment saying that you can't have a poll tax, but is the current Supreme Court, with Neil Gorsuch, who was on the court because Mitch McConnell stole a Supreme Court seat from a black president, and Brett Kavanaugh, who allegedly attempted to rape somebody, are those two guys going to vote to uphold our constitutional amendment for the poll tax? I don't think so. So you're absolutely right. You can't let all of the sadness depress you from going out to vote. In fact, the only thing you can do is to make sure you vote, make sure you fill out the census. I know you have a lot of Latino listeners and viewers, Roland. This whole census thing has been one giant attempt to discourage Latino people from filling out the census form. And filling out the census form is one of the most critical things that you can do, because it determines which states have representation and which communities have representations. We have to get the message out that people must fill out the census. So it's an all of the above strategy. But I do want to break into something you said about Tom Cotton, because look, Tom Cotton's a jerk, and we don't need to talk about him. But I don't want to let Democrats off the hook.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when the Democrats get in power, they do not do the kinds of things that are necessary to protect us from when the Republicans inevitably, cyclically retake power. The Democrats do not do a good job of appointing hardcore progressive and liberal judges who are going to defend our rights.
Right.
The Democrats do not do the job of putting in place the legal protections that people of color need to protect their votes. So the Democrats have some of this blood on their hands.
Absolutely. Which is why the election of an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley, Tlaib in Detroit, Ilhan Omar in Minneapolis is critically important, because you need folks who understand that. And that's the piece there, which means you can't get an AOC or an Ayanna Pressley or an Ilhan Omar if you don't vote.
Absolutely not. Look, I live just north of AOC's district, and depending on how the census goes, New York could lose a seat. And there are forces out here, even on the Democratic side as well as the Republican side, who hate AOC so much that they're not, I don't want to say targeting, that's too strong, but they are thinking that her seat might be a seat that they can lose. And all I got to say when they think about that is like, well, what you're really saying is that my congressman is about to lose his seat. Because if AOC has to run against my congressman, guess who I'm voting for, right? And and African Americans, Latino Americans, that's how we have to be. That's how we have to start voting. We have to start voting for what we want and not vote against what we're scared of.
Elie Mystal, I appreciate it, man. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, folks. There's a reason I'm walking y'all through this. There's a reason why we're trying to connect history with present day. I really hope Joe Biden and his campaign watches this last hour to understand how these things are all interconnected. All right, folks, back to that Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Hey, folks, MarijuanaStock.org has another great investment opportunity. If you were lucky enough to invest in their last crowdfunding campaign, you know they raised a ton of money in just a few months investing in legal marijuana farms. Those initial investors now own shares of a publicly traded company. They are certainly on fire. And now they have a new investment opportunity that is as good, if not even better, than the last. I'm talking about industrial hemp CBD. For those who don't know, the hemp plant is the cousin to marijuana with a much higher concentration of CBD, which means hemp CBD gives you all of the medical benefits of marijuana without getting you high. Until recently, hemp farming was practically illegal in the United States and heavily regulated by the DEA. However, the 2018 Farm Bill changed all of that. It is now legal to grow hemp CBD in the U.S., creating one of the largest commodities worldwide. They need land to grow all of the plants, which makes for an incredible investment opportunity. And that's where our good friends at 420 Real Estate come in. Their business model is simple. They buy land that supports hemp CBD grow operations and lease it to licensed, high-paying tenants. That's right. They are hemp CBD landlords, and you can get in on the action. You can invest in this crowdfunding campaign for as little as $200 up to $10,000. Again, you don't want to miss out. You should join, folks, if you want to, by investing. Go to marijuanastock.org to get more information. That's marijuanastock.org. You can get in the game and get in the game now. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.